So, you all know that you're here to explore, right? And for some, that means learning something new, leaning into discomfort, right? Learning from people that are around you, the idea that everyday folks can actually teach us something and bring us to another place, but then also the idea of transformation. And all of that is going to happen today in this space because of the multiple narratives that are going to take place. You're going to hear from people who have totally different experiences and different ideas and different truths. And so holding that and honoring that is going to be something that is incredibly important in this space. My challenge to you is to take that out of this building and take it out into Charlotte, because it does no good here if it doesn't do something out there. And as we're talking about out there, one of the places that I really want to focus on is our institutions of learning, whether they're schools, your living room with your children, or a place that's important to me, museums. I have a love affair and a kind of challenging relationship with museums because the idea of the single narrative is something that is incredibly pressing, and it creates this space of otherness or separateness. And so I'm going to tell you kind of this is like a real life story that happened where recently I was confronted with the notion of otherness, but really wanted to think about how to change that. So, have you guys heard of Kerry James Marshall before? Yes. So, Kerry James Marshall is an African-American artist. He was born in Birmingham, lived in LA, and is now based in Charlotte, or not Charlotte, excuse me, I wish, in Chicago. And he recently had this amazing exhibition in Chicago. So my family and I went up to see his work, and we were having an amazing time. This is an example of Kerry James Marshall's work. He's best known for his paintings, but he's a sculptor and a printmaker. And what he does is to look at the African-American experience and paint it into his artwork, okay? So in this case, where are we? Right, a beauty salon. And if we think about it, right, in popular culture, we're familiar with the idea, and also in politics, that the hair salon or the barbershop is an important part of the African-American experience. It absolutely is. You go, you get your hair done, you learn about your neighbors, right? You know, for real, right? You discuss politics. It's a place where you can be you, and on a good day, you can get new music, a movie, depending on where you are, steak, like for real, this really happens, right? But it's a place for the exchange of ideas. Now, I'm going to use a really bad movie reference, so forgive me now. We all know barbershop and beauty shop, right? There have been movies about the Black experience and the importance of the hair spot, right? I argue that anywhere that you get manicured or primed and done up is an important space for any community. If you have seen Steel Magnolias, or, and this is the really bad one, Don't Mess with the Zohan, right? Have you all seen that, right? It all takes place, is based around the beauty salon. So it's not just a Black thing. It's an us thing. It's the spaces where our communities can get together and be real and be free and have those conversations that you might not be able to have at home or at work or with other people. So we were at the museum and walking around, and my husband was in one place. My 14-year-old was literally being a 14-year-old, like pouting somewhere. And I was with my youngest son. And so we were looking around the space, and this very nice, genuinely sweet, white older man came up to me, and he said, "Oh, this is amazing." And I was like, yes, this is amazing, because I'm like a Kerry James Marshall groupie, love fan, right? And so I was like, the work is amazing. And if you haven't seen his work, you can go to the Met. And he has an exhibition right now, and the work is incredibly powerful. So we were like agreeing about the show, and then he said, "You must be really excited to see your culture represented here." And I have to be honest, and I felt bad about it in that moment, but I paused. Like, I had a real moment in my head. Not because I thought he was being anything, right? He was being genuine, he was coming from this space of positivity, but still it made me feel some kind of way. And it did because of that idea of your culture. Now, I was born in here in New York, right? So I'm an American, I went to school with a whole bunch of kids, we all learned the same thing. So the idea of this separate culture was really, really hard for me to accept. And then a couple of other things spun through my head, like I'd seen Black art in museums before, especially his, so this isn't necessarily something that is totally new or foreign to me. I also really thought about the idea of the master narrative. Have you guys heard that term before? Toni Morrison's term, the master narrative. And this idea that actually informs the way that we learn. There's a singular thread that links history and culture, and we look at it through the lens of the white Christian male. It is what it is. So I immediately become the other as a Black person and as a woman. And so that went through my head, and then I also thought about the American Alliance of Museums, right, because we're sitting in a museum space having this conversation. And on their website, they have a museum fact sheet. And it says, a couple of the facts that it states, is that one, museums are not only places of learning, but people actually trust what they see in museums more than they believe what they read in textbooks, right? And if you think about the relationship that we have in museums, these objects that are in this space, or these spaces, are hollow, right? They're important, they're the objects that we, whoever the great we are, have decided represent the truth and the important parts of our culture. And so they're in this space, and we go to see them, and we learn that these things are special. The other thing that it said is that adults and children learn in that space. So as custodians of this knowledge, it's really, really important that we think about the narratives that we are presenting. And I think it's fantastic. Yes, artists of color and artists who are women are having more and more shows. But what does it mean to break the narrative, not create a separate one, but to combine the narrative to show contemporary women artists, artists of color, and traditionally accepted contemporary artists at the same time, in the same space, without having to designate this is a woman's show, right? Or this is an artist of color. How does that change the framework and the way that we learn? So I had to think about how to, and all this literally went through my head in like a second, right? So I had to really think about how to answer him. So we were standing next to this painting by Kerry James Marshall, and I said, oh yeah, you know, I'm absolutely glad to see this work. And by the way, that's the painting over on, what is this, my left, all right? I get that confused sometimes. But Andrew Wyeth actually is an artist that Kerry James Marshall looks at, and he purposefully references art history because he is painting people of color into the canon as active participants, not just as servants or people in the background. So we were standing next to that painting, and I said, oh yeah, you know, he was inspired by Andrew Wyeth's famous painting of Christina. And he looked at it, and I looked at it, and he smiled, and I smiled, and then he kind of went this way, and I went that way. And I chose to answer the question that way, partly because that's what Kerry James Marshall is doing. He is actively painting people into the framework, right? He's forcing us to have conversations based on visual references that include folks that have traditionally been left out of the conversation into the conversation. And while they are Black, it's not just about Blackness. And so, you know, we continued to look at the show, and we had a really great time. And after kind of seeing the exhibition and kind of having that experience, I thought about the other ways that people are being active in museums, and probably ways that museums don't necessarily want us to be. But but at the same time that can potentially move the needle so that we think about this other narrative. This happened, this is an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. It happened about 2 summers ago. And one of the paintings on view was this painting right here, this Monet painting, and that's his wife dressed in a kimono holding a fan. And their public program for the day was on certain days you could come in and dress it in a kimono and hold the fan and pose like her and take your picture. And people from the Asian community, and I use that broadly, understanding what that means, right? People from the Asian community responded against it. As Asian Americans, right, a lot of people are talking about this idea of being a prop versus the museum encouraging people to have substantial conversations about the relationship between Europe and the Americas, and in this case, Japan, and the history of that kind of forced exchange of goods, let's say, in policy and politics. And so people just felt like, this is costuming, this is this is all about making us a prop. And so there were a number of responses. People came out, social media was on fire about all this that was happening. And then the museum had to have a conversation. And so they invited in people from the community. They invited in their curatorial staff to have a conversation about the impacts. Because we in the field talk a lot about inclusion. But what does that really mean? Putting up an image does not mean inclusion. Having people at the table, understanding the sensitivities, looking at history, and allowing all of those voices to come together to present a real, solid consideration, not even an idea, but a consideration of a moment in time or a collective of people, or even an art historical style is really, really important. So, as we leave this space, I really encourage some of my colleagues in the arts to really think about, what are we doing? What conversations are we having? How are we framing this work? And take on the responsibility, if we are really these trusted spaces where people completely believe and are inspired by what we're putting out there, let's change what we're putting out there. Let's be more reflective. Let's be truly diverse and inclusionary. And the Gorilla Girls, who are like probably my favorite, they're a group of women in the arts who remain anonymous because they wear these gorilla masks. And what they do is to talk about and actually challenge museums to think about who is in their collections. Because again, it's not enough to just show. Who are you supporting financially? What narratives are you putting together? Who are we defining as other? And how do we break that framework? So, thank you.